a busy week for Alabama on the recruiting trail. We'll get into a little bit of that in just a bit, but now it's time to turn the attention toward the Clemson Tigers. Alabama expected to get on the practice field the latter part of this week and begin preparations for the college football semifinal matchup against Clemson at the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans inside the Mercedes-Benz Superdome on New Year's night. It's the third year in a row the Tide will face the Tigers. The previous two, of course, in the championship game, this year in the semifinals, but great matchup on paper. You know, I said earlier that Clemson last year and the previous 2 years had Deshaun Watson. Quite frankly, Rodney, I didn't expect them to be back in the college football playoff this year without Deshaun Watson. But Dabo Swinney has built a program. He's not based on just one great player. This is a total program and the number one team in the country and going to be a big challenge for Alabama.
Huge challenge. I think when you look at them, you know, it was Deshaun Watson that was kind of the face of the program there. But now when you think of Clemson, the first thing you think about on this team is their defensive front. So that's a change. Not that they weren't great last year, because they were up front defensively, but now when you talk about them, the first thing that really comes to mind is their defensive line, their defensive front as a whole. So, you know, I think that's really, as Alabama looks at it this year, whereas last year, you know, you were thinking about, okay, this Alabama defense is going to have to slow down Deshaun Watson and that explosive Clemson offense. Now you're thinking the Alabama offense is going to have to create and find ways to move the ball against this Clemson defensive front. So things have changed, but you're right. I think that's an indication when you're talking about a real program. Sometimes the team is different. It has a different characteristic, has different, identity to some extent, but it's still really successful. So I think you have to hand that to Dabo Swinney. Done a great job.
No doubt about it. I was discussing this earlier in the program. You could make an argument. I know both teams are just focused on winning the national championship. That's what it's all about. You play all year to put yourself in this position. Only 4 teams have done it. But you can make the argument if Clemson beats Alabama in the semifinal and then goes ahead and beats either Georgia or Oklahoma in the championship game in Atlanta, that Clemson will have surpassed Alabama as the dominant program in college football.
Absolutely. I don't think there's any doubt about it. That would mean that they could have easily won 3 in a row. Now, you know, Alabama's in position, too, to say, hey, you know, here we've now won 2 of the last 3. So we're still the dominant team. So, you know, a lot of it does hinge, I think, on this game and then obviously the next game. But I agree with you. I mean, if Clemson wins it, then, Dabo Swinney's king.
You look at Alabama where they're going to be trying to improve, and there'll be a lot of areas. Both these teams, as I said, are going to hit the practice field hard, working on some things that they think they need to do better, and also probably putting in some wrinkles for the semifinal game. But when you look at Alabama, probably one of the things they're going to say is, hey, third downs. On offense, we've got to be more productive on converting third downs, and on defense, we've got to do a better job of getting off the field on third downs. You look at the Auburn game, Alabama's last game, and their only loss of the season. You could certainly say that they lost that game on third down on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, again, I look at it like this, and I realize you can have a poor third down defense, but if your offense can't move the ball, can't possess it, and you're 3 of 11 on third down, it's going to make it really really difficult, even on the most talented defensive teams. And I think that, that was kind of the deal in this game against Auburn, was offensively could not sustain anything, 3 of 11. And hence, I think the defense was in a very difficult spot. The offense had, 60 plays? I don't know what Auburn ran, but, it's obviously considerably more. And I just think it was a very difficult thing for the offense to overcome, or rather the defense to overcome in that situation.
Well, what does Alabama need to do to improve on third down offense?
Well, I think, first of all, you've got to be able to, like I've said, I think the first thing is key is first down, Gary. First and second down. You've got to be able to get yourself in positions where you're not facing 3rd and 7, 3rd and 8. I would have to go back and check how many of those 11 third downs were, 5 or more yards. But I do think it's very difficult against a great defense when you're not successful on first and second down. And again, I haven't really looked to see what the third down statistic was in terms of yardage needed, but I do think that that's really the key. So let's see what Alabama does on first and second down. I think Alabama, too, obviously has got to be more successful with a threat in the passing game. They've got to be consistent, being able to consistently throw the ball, spread the ball around to different receivers. If they can create some diversity, then I think it makes it a lot easier on the running game. I've said all year long, even before the season started, it's just my opinion, it's my observation, is that if Alabama could throw the ball consistently and throw it well and back teams, kind of keep teams on their heels a little bit with that balance, then I think the running game would be off the charts because it's pretty good. I mean, they ran for 209 yards on 37 carries, I think it was, against Auburn. That's really not bad against that defense. I mean, that's 5.6 yards per carry, I think. So, I think the running game is there. I just think they need a little help and consistency in the passing game.
What does Alabama up front? You mentioned the defensive front for Clemson. Christian Wilkins and those guys are nasty. They sacked Auburn 11 times earlier this season. What does that offensive line for Alabama need to do to consistently block those guys, especially in the passing game, to give Jalen Hurts time to get the ball out of his hand? How big a challenge is that for that Alabama offensive line?
Well, I mean, obviously it's a huge challenge. I mean, it's the best defensive front I think they've gone against this year. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And Auburn was really good. Let's give it to them. But again, I don't know exactly how, Clemson gets a lot of pressure with just their front guys. They don't have to blitz a lot. So I just think it's going to be really a big, big challenge for this offense to protect Jalen Hurts when they do throw the football and to get a push, Gary. I mean, their defensive front is obviously really against the run as well. So I just think that, from that standpoint, hopefully Alabama will be healthy up front going into that game. Obviously, Pierce Baker has had some injuries, and then, Hassenauer did a great job. And guess what? He gets hurt early in the Auburn game after doing such a great job being the SEC offensive lineman of the league against Mercer. And then Pierce Baker's put in there, and he's not 100%. And that's really difficult. We've seen times when they've had injuries on the offensive line, Gary. You remember when Barrett Jones was limping around back in 2010? It makes it difficult. It makes it really difficult because when there's a missing link up front, it's like the whole thing is messed up.
Rodney Orr, our guest here on the Gary Harris Show on the Bud Light Hotline, talking Alabama versus Clemson. Defensively for Alabama, again, this offense that Clemson has is different from a year ago when they were loaded with Deshaun Watson, wide receivers, Gallman at running back. But this is a very good Clemson offense, and Kelly Bryant has made plays, both running and passing, and they've got the Bama killer, Hunter Renfrow, the wide receiver that the first two times these two teams have played. For all the great offensive weapons that Clemson has put on the field, it's been Renfrow that's been the thorn in Alabama's side. How are they going to defend this guy this year?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, number 23 for Auburn had a really good game, I think, in a similar position. So you got to find a way to cover him and try to limit him. But Alabama has not had success, as you mentioned, in those two games over the last couple of years. It's just been amazing how, like you said, he's been a thorn in the side, so to speak. Who are you going to put on him? I don't know. Are they going to put Tony Brown on him again? How are you going to defend him? I mean, obviously, I do think this, Gary. Deshaun Watson was really at another level. Kelly Bryant, good. He's not Deshaun Watson. So I think that's one thing that's going to be a benefit for Alabama without question. And I do think, too, while Clemson has some good wide receivers and tight ends, they did lose some from the last two games that that Alabama played against them. Obviously, they lost some really talented guys. So I don't think they're going up against, obviously, not the same quarterback, but the same talent as far as those receivers are concerned that surround Renfrow. So, we'll see what they do.
Jeremy Pruitt announced last week he is going to the University of Tennessee as the head football coach. Alabama's current DC. He will coach Alabama through the playoff. If the Tide is successful against Clemson, he'll be there for the national championship game as well. Nick Saban probably has more experience, but there's no doubt he has more experience than any coach in the country dealing with this situation. It seems like now practically it's every year. But still, it's different. You've got a guy who's trying to finish off his job at Alabama, see this team through to the national championship, and on the other hand, he's putting together a staff. He's making recruiting calls for Tennessee. How do you think this is going to affect Jeremy Pruitt?
Well, Jeremy Pruitt, first of all, I think he's going to do his best. I really do. I think he wanted to come back and coach these guys through the playoff game or games. I think that was his attitude, that he wanted to do it. I don't think that, he felt twisted arm or whatever to have to do it, or that it was just simply an obligation that he had to carry out. I think it's what he wanted to do, and I think that's a big difference. Certainly a positive thing. So I think he's going to do really well in terms of preparing the team, preparing the defense. I don't think there's any question about that. But again, you mentioned Gary. He's got a lot on his table. He's been trying to hire coaches. Now is a key time in recruiting. This early signing period is going to be right while he's coaching at Alabama. He's going to be trying to sign players for Tennessee from December 20th through the 22nd. So I think it's extremely difficult what he has to do. But I do think that, number one, Nick Saban will help him manage it. And I do think that Jeremy Pruitt is determined to do a good job. So, I think it'll go as well as it possibly could in those circumstances.
Alabama and Clemson in the Sugar Bowl on New Year's night, college football playoff semifinal. This is unusual to face a team in the postseason for a third straight year. Both of these staffs know each other well. These players know each other well. They're 1-1 in their previous two meetings, as we've talked about. They don't play in the regular season, at least not scheduled to play anytime soon. But is this a rivalry, in your opinion, Alabama versus Clemson now?
Well, yeah, I think probably you could say that. I mean, it's a little bit different, but I think there's obviously I sense it as a very respectful thing. It's not, just looking at it from the outside, Gary. I mean, you're like me. You kind of evaluate feelings or emotions or whatever it might be towards one school or another. To me, it's a little bit different than, say, if Alabama and Ohio State were doing this 2 or 3 years in a row. You know what I mean? I just think there's a lot. It's just a different feel to it. But rivalry in a very respectful way, yeah, I think it certainly is. But again, I see some other things, some other possibilities out there, like if it were Ohio State. I think there's a little bit more, I don't know, you just sense a little bit, I don't know if it's because of Urban Meyer, Nick Saban, or, that dynamic there where maybe everybody thinks, they're always comparing these two as the best in the game right now, or whatever it is. It just seems to have a little bit different feel than maybe what that one would have. But, yeah, I could see what you're saying, certainly.
How ironic is it that this is the third straight year these teams have faced off, and that Clemson's led by an Alabama guy, Dabo Swinney, played here, coached here, got a lot of members of his staff that have Alabama connections, either as players or coaches. And now that it's the third year in a row, it seems to be a lot less talk about Dabo versus Alabama, but we know it's a special game for him. It is just, and of course, Clemson has a history of hiring coaches with Alabama ties, but still a little bit of irony. That's Dabo versus Alabama again. It's just 3 years in a row.
Well, it's really uncanny what you said there about the history of the Clemson ending up with Alabama coaches, and Frank Howard, Hootie, Coach Hootie Jones, Hootie Ingram, obviously. Charlie Pell,
Danny Ford,
Danny Ford, all these guys that they've had through the years that with the Alabama background, it is amazing. And when you look at their greatest success, I mean, obviously Dabo's, that probably had more success than anybody. Obviously Danny Ford won a national championship in 1981. But it is kind of uncanny that so many of those guys are Alabama guys, and you just wonder how's that play out like that. It's just amazing.
It really, really is. I mentioned recruiting. The one advantage Alabama had by not making it to Atlanta for the championship game was they were able to get out on the road and do some recruiting. And it's been a productive time for Alabama. Why don't you update us on the latest Crimson Tide recruiting efforts? There's been some commitments. There have been some other guys who are reportedly leaning toward the Tide. Catch us up right there on recruiting.
Well, they had a weekend this weekend. Most of the guys that came in were committed players already. A couple of guys that I would keep an eye on. Christian Barmore out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, is a big defensive lineman. Got great size. Gary, 6'6", 290. Guy that really burst on the scene down the stretch of recruiting. Picked up several SEC offers. I think that right now Alabama's in great position with him. They need him. I mean, they need defensive linemen. So he's a key. Yabi Anoma from Baltimore, Maryland was also in, and he is another key to this recruiting class. Maybe the best pass rusher in the country, certainly one of them. And I just think that Alabama's in great position with him as well. And again, I think over the next week or two, we'll start kind of getting a better feel, but it's getting tougher. I'm just telling you. These coaching changes are making it tougher. Started last year with Kirby Smart, and I think now with Pruitt going to Tennessee, with Jimbo Fisher at Texas A&M, I just think it's getting tougher and tougher. Mullen's going to do a good job recruiting at Florida. Taggart down at FSU. I just think the competition's really picking up. I think there's some guys, Gary, out there that have been longtime leans to Alabama that now I'm really leery that they're going to end up elsewhere. For example, Jalen Waddle, who I think is the most dynamic player in the country with the ball in his hands, in a long-time Alabama lean 6 or 7 months. And I think Jimbo Fisher's turned that thing around. He's from Bel Air, Texas, outside of Houston. He visited there this weekend, and I think that's a good possibility. That's where he's going to end up. Alabama's probably going to visit him later this week. We'll see what happens. Pruitt has made a really big inroad on tight end Dominic Wood-Anderson, who's the number one JUCO tight end in the country. Some people have said he's got skills similar to O.J. Howard. I think Alabama's been in good position with him, but there's some talk now that, all of a sudden Tennessee might be his team. We'll see how it all shakes out. The bottom line is I think it's getting more and more difficult to recruit because the competition's really, really picking up.
Oh, it absolutely is. You make a great point. And not only is it getting more difficult, but a lot of these guys that you're talking about, Fisher, Smart, Pruitt, they have the Saban blueprint.
Absolutely.
They're using the same philosophy that Nick Saban did to build Alabama, so it's going to get tougher and tougher. The Tide did finally pick up the commitment last week from Joseph, the cornerback, and that's and Savion Smith as well. So they got the 2 corners that they had long wanted to get commitments from. Yeah,
and they're supposedly Josh Jobe. He's another great corner. He's supposedly close to flipping to Alabama. He's from originally from Miami. He's been at Cheshire Academy up in Connecticut over the last, this fall playing up there. So if they get him, he's been committed to Miami. But if they get him, that would be another huge, huge pickup. And again, I think I still think Alabama will finish well overall across the board. But Gary, these days of signing 16 top 100 players, that's going to be more and more difficult.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, it's just, like you said, the landscape of college football in the Southeastern Conference has changed, and coaches understand that it all starts with recruiting, and you've got a lot of these guys that, as we talked about, came up under Nick Saban, so they understand the way to do it. And it is going to be very, very difficult to continue to kind of have the hauls that they've had in the past, but nonetheless, it should be good for Alabama in 2018. Rodney, tell everybody where they can, or how they can get hooked up with TiderInsider.com.
Yeah, TiderInsider.com. It's only $48 a year. You can get instant access with your credit card right now or a check if you prefer. It gives you access to all our premium information. Going to have a recruiting update later today when we can compile everything. There's a lot of discussion on our forums, Gary, constantly about some of these coaching situations. Could be. That's another thing that's going to be real interesting is to see these new 2 coaches that Alabama brings on board. I think those are going to be really key hires. But anyway, we'll have it all covered right there at TiderInsider.com.
Yeah, since you mentioned that, before I let you go, just your thoughts on obviously Jeremy Pruitt's still here for the playoff, but defensive coordinator-wise, hearing anything, any idea on where they may turn, where Saban may turn for a new defensive coordinator?
You know, kind of gone back and forth on some of the thinking based on things I've heard over the last week or so, Gary. I'm kind of back to that thinking that there's, Tosh LaFoy may be the guy, get bumped up, promising young coach, obviously. Then you still have 2 spots to fill. I think there's some guys out there that you really probably need a big-time recruiter at one of those spots, because they could use a bump there. Maybe a Tim Brewster who's at FSU. There's talk of the Michigan linebackers coach, Chris Partridge, who's done a fabulous job up there. Last 2 years, he's been National Recruiter of the Year. So those are 2 guys that are mentioned. Again, we'll see how it all unfolds. Could be really interesting because I do think, Gary, that the 2 guys that they hire, it's really key here as you start to move forward because, again, I can't stress enough, the competition's changing. It's getting tougher.
No doubt about it. Rodney Orr, check him out at TiderInsider.com. Also, Tider Insider TV Tuesday nights at 6:30 on WQA 23. Thanks a lot, Rod.
Okay, buddy. Take care.